The ballroom at Ashvale House had seen 30 years of London seasons, and it had learned, the way old rooms do, to hold its breath at the right moment. Roberta Campbell stood at the edge of its light, her ivory gown retrimmed once too many times, the lace at her cuffs slightly thinner than the lace at her collar, and she watched the Earl of Ashvale cross the floor toward her as though the crowd were water parting for a stone. He did not look at the chandeliers. He did not look at Miss Cecily Fairfax, who stood 3 yards to Bertie's left in a gown the color of champagne, her diamonds catching every available ray. He looked at Bertie. She did not understand it. She would not understand it for a long time yet, and the not understanding would cost her more than she anticipated. What she did not yet know was that cost and clarity are sometimes the same thing, and that the thing she was about to lose was the thing she would need to lose before she could receive anything else. She had arrived in London 6 weeks earlier with a hired trunk, £40 annual wage, and the specific, well-practiced stillness of a woman who has decided not to take up too much room in the world. Her father, William Campbell, had died in February, and the estate he left behind him in Derbyshire had been claimed almost immediately by the entail. His grandfather had never thought to dissolve. £800 a year gone with the probate. £3,200 of debt attached to the property, transferred with it to the cousin who received it. Bertie had received nothing, except the wages her father owed the housemaids, which she paid before she packed. Mrs. Pendleton, who had been a school friend of her mother's, and who now moved through London society in the comfortable middle distance between acceptability and invisibility, had offered Bertie the position of companion at the beginning of March. £40 per annum, room and board, accompaniment to the season's events. It was not rescue. Bertie did not think of it as rescue. It was a shelf to stand on while she determined what came next, and she was grateful for the shelf without permitting herself to expect anything above it. Mrs. Pendleton was a kind woman with round cheeks and a tendency to misplace her opera glasses. She introduced Bertie to the households they visited as, "My dear Miss Campbell, my companion." And she meant it warmly, and it was still a sentence that arrived in her room before Bertie did, and arranged the furniture around her. The season had its taxonomies. A companion was neither a guest nor a servant, which meant she was neither entirely seen nor entirely invisible, which meant she occupied a peculiar transparency that the ballrooms and drawing-rooms of London had perfected the art of looking through. Lady Dorothea Voss had no patience for the peculiar. She was 61 years old, with silver hair dressed so precisely it seemed structural, and she had organized her life around the understanding that her son's future was a property she held in trust for the Ashvale line. Edmund was 34, recently returned from 2 years of near-total solitude at Thornfield Park, and she required him to marry well. Miss Cecily Fairfax was well. Miss Cecily Fairfax had £12,000 a year, a title in the right drawer, and the kind of pleasant, untroubling face that would sit in family portraits without incident. The match was logical. It was also, in Lady Dorothea's precise estimation, nearly settled. The first evening Bertie and Edmund occupied the same room was at the Haverstock Ball in early April. Bertie had been standing near the east wall with Mrs. Envers, Pendleton's shawl draped over her arm, watching the patterns of the dancers and thinking, with the dry private amusement she permitted herself in small doses, that the season was simply the marriage market renamed and given better lighting. It was not a charitable observation, she kept it to herself. Edmund arrived late, which London had already decided was his prerogative. He was tall, with close-cropped dark hair, and the kind of face that had been arranged by discipline into something resembling stone. And he came into the room without the usual ritual of surveying it, which meant either that he did not care what the room held, or that he had already decided it held nothing of interest. Lady Dorothea was at his side immediately, steering him toward a cluster of the season's most valued guests, with the efficiency of a woman who had been steering things for decades. Bertie had turned back to the dancers when she became aware that the conversation, 6 feet to her left, had shifted in a way that involved her name. Not her name, precisely. A description. The hired companion, Lady Dorothea said to Mrs. Denny. Featherstone, whose position in London gossip was roughly equivalent to a printing press. Mrs. Pendleton's little arrangement. A vicar's daughter, I believe. No, a solicitor. Something provincial. No connections of any use. Nothing to recommend her for the season, except the patience to carry a shawl. Mrs. Featherstone laughed. Bertie did not move. She had learned over the preceding weeks that the best response to this species of assessment was stillness, because stillness could not be read as either shame or defiance, and therefore deprived the assessment of its preferred audience. She kept her face pleasant and her eyes on the dancers, and her hands loose around Mrs. Pendleton's shawl. What she did not observe, because she was practicing her stillness with full attention, was the man who had stopped 3 feet behind her. Edmund had arrived at that section of the wall for no apparent reason, moving away from his mother's orbit for the first time that evening, and he had heard the description. His jaw had tightened once, briefly, in a way that Lady Dorothea would have recognized and no one else in the room noticed. Then he looked at the woman who had received the description, and she was standing with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands perfectly quiet, and he felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately name. He named it nothing. He had been naming things nothing for 2 years. He had also by the end of that evening found 2 separate reasons to pass through that section of the wall again. If you are finding your way into this story for the first time, take a breath and settle in. What happens to Bertie Campbell across the weeks of this particular London season belongs to the patient kind of telling, the kind where everything that matters is planted before it flowers, and there is more planted here than is immediately visible. Stay with it. The dare came 3 days later at the Linfield soirée. Bertie had not yet learned that Edmund Voss carried about him the specific reputation of a man who refused dares, which was why they kept being offered to him. Some young lord, flushed with claret and the season's particular variety of boredom, announced loudly to the 3 men beside him that no one would cross the room and ask Mrs. Pendleton's little companion to dance. Not because it was unkind, because it was pointless. And dancing with the companion was the kind of action that said something about a man's judgment, and not something flattering. Edmund had been standing near the fireplace. He had heard the dare. He crossed the room in the next 40 seconds. Bertie, who had not heard the dare because she had been helping Mrs. Pryse. Pendleton found the opera glasses she had again misplaced, looked up from the small gilt chair to find the Earl of Ashvale standing in front of her with his hand extended, and his expression precisely as readable as a closed door. "Miss Campbell," he said, "if you are not otherwise engaged." She was not otherwise engaged. She was never otherwise engaged. She took his hand because refusing would have required an explanation she did not have, and she stood, and they moved to the edge of the floor, and she spent the next 4 minutes trying to understand why a man of his position had come to stand in front of her. She arrived at the only conclusion that seemed to fit. He had been directed here by his mother, for reasons she could not yet identify. She held that conclusion and danced carefully, and said as little as possible, because carefulness and silence were the 2 resources she had in reliable supply. Edmund said only one thing of substance during those 4 minutes. He said, "You hold yourself as though you expect to be looked through." Bertie considered the sentence. "That is generally the most efficient arrangement," she said. He did not respond. She had not expected him to respond. When the music ended, he returned her to Mrs. Bree. Pendleton sighed, and he did not look back, and she watched him cross toward the fireplace and told herself firmly that the warmth in her wrist, where his hand had rested, was a physical coincidence. It was not a physical coincidence. His attention, though she could not credit it as attention, had already begun its accumulation. The weeks that followed produced a pattern she could not quite account for. At the Harcastle dinner he sat at the far end of the table and spoke to no one within 3 places of her, and yet twice she glanced up and found him already looking, and he was already looking elsewhere. At the Beaumont garden party, when Lord Adderley made a remark about companions being present as furniture, Edmund had said, very quietly and from across the table, "That observation speaks poorly of the room's furniture. Adderley." Lord Adderley had blinked. Bertie had told herself this was simply the Earl's well-documented disdain for poor conversation, which had nothing to do with her specifically. She was trained by now to make herself small enough not to need things. It was the only practical skill her particular circumstances had produced, and she had refined it across the 6 weeks since her father's funeral, with the specific diligence of someone who understood that expecting too much is its own variety of exposure. She did not expect the Earl of Ashvale to notice her in any way that mattered. She therefore read every instance of his attention as something that could not possibly be what it appeared to be. The second voicing of the dismissive label came at the Ashvale townhouse, where Lady Dorothea had organized a small Tuesday musicale and Mrs. Pendleton had been invited and Bertie had come in Mrs. Pendleton's wake. Bertie was standing in the music room's anteroom, adjusting the clasp on Mrs. Pendleton's bracelet, when she heard Lady Dorothea through the half-open door. "She is the hired companion, and nothing more," Lady Dorothea said to Miss Fairfax, whose expression was carefully pleasant as always. "A pretty enough creature, I suppose, in the way that provincial girls occasionally are. No family, no fortune, no consequence. Edmund's attention is chivalry. He has always had an inconvenient habit of noticing strays." Miss Fairfax said nothing. Her expression suggested she had already filed this information and moved on. Bertie finished adjusting the bracelet clasp and kept her face entirely neutral. The clasp was a small silver one fashioned like a knot, and she thought with careful deliberateness about the mechanics of the knot, rather than about the words she had just heard. The word stray, in particular, she placed somewhere she would not have to look at it. The witnessing came the following week on a Tuesday afternoon, when Mrs. Pendleton had business with her solicitor, and Bertie had been given 2 hours of time that was technically her own. She had walked to the Ashvale Town House Gardens, which were open that afternoon for a charity improvement that Lady Dorothea patronized, and she had intended to look at the roses, which were in early bloom, and asked nothing of her. She had not expected to find Lady Dorothea herself, in the far corner of the garden near the old stone bench, seated with the composed patience of a woman who has arranged the meeting precisely. Lady Dorothea was accompanied by a footman who held a small folding table, and on the folding table was a wooden box. "Miss Campbell," Lady Dorothea said pleasantly. "How convenient! Do sit down." Bertie sat. She had learned that sitting when invited was less costly than refusing in the moment, because it preserved options. "I will be direct," Lady Dorothea said. "I appreciate efficiency. You have, I think, developed an impression on my son's attention, however briefly, and however accidentally. I am not suggesting it is deliberate on your part. Nevertheless, it is inconvenient. The Ashvale succession requires a specific kind of match, and you are not that match. You understand the mathematics without my explaining them. Bertie understood the mathematics. I would like," Lady Dorothea continued, "to make the situation easier for everyone. You have, I understand, a father's debt attached to the Campbell estate. £3,200 is a meaningful sum for a woman in your position." She opened the wooden box. Inside, it was a sheaf of banknotes, neatly arranged. "This is £200, not a fortune, but sufficient to allow you to resign your position with Mrs. Pendleton at the season's close and establish yourself comfortably enough outside London in exchange for your absence." Bertie looked at the banknotes. She looked at them with the specific quality of attention one applies to something whose surface is clean and whose implications are not. "I appreciate the directness," she said. "I will not take the money." Lady Dorothea's composure did not move. "It is a generous offer, given your circumstances." "It is a generous offer," Bertie agreed. "I will not take it. My circumstances are mine to manage, and I would prefer to manage them without arrangements that ask me to behave as though I have done something wrong when I have not." She stood because the sentence she had just said was all she had to say, and prolonging the encounter would only dilute it. She thanked Lady Dorothea for the garden party and for the roses, which were very fine, and she walked back along the gravel path toward the garden's front gate. She did not see the figure who had been standing in the doorway of the garden's east-facing conservatory, close enough to the stone bench to have heard the whole exchange. Edmund had come to the townhouse from his morning ride and had stepped into the garden for no specific reason, and had chosen the conservatory doorway to stand in because the roses were better visible from there. He had not moved during the conversation. He had not moved after it either for a long moment. While Bertie's straight-backed figure crossed the gravel and passed through the gate, he stood there for a long time after she had gone. Something he had been carrying for 2 years had shifted in his chest. He recognized the sensation, distantly with the specific wariness of a man who had learned that shifting things could also collapse. Edmund Voss had married at 27-7, a match his mother had arranged, and which he had entered without objection, because he had not yet understood that absence of objection is not the same as will. His wife Catherine had been gentle and bewildered and not in good health, and Edmund had believed, with the methodical confidence of a man who had never failed at a thing he organized, that he could manage her fragile constitution the way he managed the 11,000 acres of Thornfield Park, through attention and order and the correct allocation of resources. The child, a son, had arrived too early in November and had lived for 9 days. Catherine had not survived the fever that followed. Edmund had stood at the graves in the Thornfield churchyard on a December morning 2 years past, and understood with a clarity that felt like cold water in the lungs that his organizing intelligence had failed at the one thing that required something other than intelligence. He had not wept. He had closed the piano in the long gallery, because Catherine had played it on their first evening at Thornfield, and he could not bear the bench empty, and he had put 2 years of silence between himself and the world. The piano stood closed still. He thought of it now in the garden doorway, and thought of the woman who had just refused his mother's £200 without raising her voice, and thought that he did not deserve the particular feeling currently occupying his chest. He was probably right about that. He was right about very little else. Bertie did not know she had been witnessed. She returned to Mrs. Wend, Pendleton's rented house in Portman Street, and sat with her mending for the rest of the afternoon, and permitted herself to feel, for a short while, the clean anger of having been assessed at a price and having declined to be sold. Then she folded the anger away, because anger was expensive, and she was working on a £40 annual income, and she took up her needle. The announcement, when it came, arrived in the way that the worst things tend to arrive, not all at once, but in 2 pieces. The second piece more devastating than the first. The first piece was Mrs. Featherstone, who called on Mrs. Spasis Pendleton the following Thursday, with the elaborate casualness of a woman who had been carrying something combustible and had finally found the right room to set it down in. There had been, she said, a letter. A letter from Bertie, allegedly, or at least in a hand that resembled Bertie's, to a young gentleman whose name Mrs. Featherstone declined to specify, but whose connection to a married woman of Lady Dorothea's acquaintance was sufficiently notorious that its implications were unavoidable. The letter, it was said, suggested an assignation. The letter had been circulating since the previous evening. Bertie felt the floor of the morning shift beneath her in a way she recognized, with a distant professional calm, as the specific sensation of a thing one has feared. Finding. Found. She had not written the letter. She had written enough letters in her life to know her own hand, and she also knew with the resigned clarity of someone who has spent the season learning how the machinery operates, precisely who had. Mrs. Pendleton was distressed. Mrs. Pendleton was the kind of woman whose distress expressed itself in a great deal of rapid movement and the misplacing of additional objects. She did not ask Bertie directly whether the letter was genuine, because she was too kind for that, but the second piece of the announcement arrived that same afternoon in the form of a note from Mrs. Off. Pendleton's sister-in-law, who hosted the dinner parties that were Mrs. Pendleton's principal social resource, advising her, with regret, that the current association between her household and the Campbell situation had made the next dinner party something of an impossibility, Mrs. said us. Pendleton, weeping quietly into her handkerchief in the sitting room, told Bertie that she was very sorry, and that she truly did not believe the letter was what it appeared to be, and that she hoped Bertie understood, and that the situation was simply impossible. Bertie understood. She packed that evening. Now, this is the moment when many women in Bertie's position would have done the obvious thing. The letter she had found slipped beneath her door with no indication of its author, but with Lady Dorothea's crested notepaper just visible beneath the folded page, was evidence. It was the draft. The handwriting in the draft was not Bertie's. Not quite. Though it had been carefully shaped to suggest it. Anyone with Bertie's actual correspondence for comparison would have seen the difference in 30 seconds. The obvious thing was to go to someone, anyone, with the draft in hand, and to save herself with it. To place it in the hands of a solicitor or magistrate, or one of the women in the season who had known Bertie long enough to evaluate the evidence to use it. She sat in her small room at Mrs. Pendleton's house for an hour, with the draft on the table in front of her and her hands in her lap. She thought about £800 per year gone. She thought about £3,200 of debt she had not incurred and could not repay. She thought about £40 per year, also now gone. She thought about Lady Dorothea in the garden with her wooden box and about the word stray, and about what it meant to have been arranged out of a man's life by his mother for the offense of having briefly occupied some small portion of his attention. She thought about Edmund at the edge of the Haverstock ballroom, saying that she held herself as though she expected to be looked through. She folded the draft carefully and put on her coat and walked to Ashvale House. She gave the letter to Edmund herself. He received her in the library, which was the only room available at that hour, and he stood at the far side of a mahogany desk with the particular stillness she had come to recognize as his resting condition, and she placed the folded draft on the desk in front of him and said, "This is the original from which the copy in circulation was made. I have not used it. I did not write it. I am not using it now in the expectation of anything in return. I am giving it to you because it involves your household, and because it is yours to decide what to do with, not mine." He did not touch the letter immediately. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that was not his usual careful arrangement of distance, and she looked back at him because she had run out of reasons to look anywhere else. "Where are you going?" he said. "I do not yet know," she said. "I will manage." She turned to leave because she had done what she came to do, and remaining would begin to resemble expectation, and expectation was the one luxury she had deliberately not packed. "Miss Campbell," he said behind her. She stopped. "Bertie?" he said. No one had called her Bertie in 6 months, not since her father's study in Derbyshire, where he had called her that every morning over the post. The syllables arrived in the library air with a weight she was not prepared for, and she held very still against it. "Stay," he said. She did not stay. She could not stay, not on those terms, not without understanding what the terms were, and he did not say anything else. And she left. Edmund stood at the mahogany desk for some time after the door had closed behind her. Then he unfolded the draft and read it, and his face went through several arrangements before it settled on the one he carried into the next morning. The Ashvale House party had been scheduled for 3 weeks, planned by Lady Dorothea the previous autumn as the season's proper climax and the venue in which Miss Cecily Fairfax would receive her natural advantage. 40 guests, a small orchestra. The long gallery opened for the first time since Catherine's death. Lady Dorothea had overseen every arrangement with the satisfaction of a general who has read the terrain correctly and knows which ground favors her. She had not read the terrain correctly. Edmund arrived at the house party having spent the intervening days in conversation with Mr. Brelling. Gerald Hartby, his solicitor, who had confirmed, among other things, that the entailed estates presented no legal obstacle to the arrangement Edmund had in mind, and that the arrangement itself was entirely within his authority to make. Hartby was a cautious man who appreciated precision, and he had confirmed the relevant points twice, and then held his peace, because his opinion had not been solicited. The evening of the house party was warm for June. The long gallery's candles lit at 4 in the afternoon to let the room accumulate its gold before the guests arrived. Miss Fairfax entered on her mother's arm in a gown the color of pale rose, with the pearls her family had given her for the season at her throat. Lady Dorothea received her with the specific warmth she reserved for things she had already decided upon. Bertie was not expected. She had not been invited. She was there because Mrs. Pendleton had been invited, and Mrs. Pendleton, whose heart was larger than her social calculation, had refused to attend without her companion, and had written as much to Lady Dorothea. Lady Dorothea had replied with a brief note, granting the inclusion, with the gracious negligence of a woman who considers the inclusion inconsequential. Bertie stood at the edge of the long gallery, in the gown she had packed in the hired trunk, the ivory one with the retrimmed lace, and she watched the room assemble itself around its own brightness, and felt the specific calm of a woman who has ceased to expect anything, and has, surprisingly, found it peaceful. She did not see Edmund arrive. She became aware of him the way one becomes aware of a change in the weather, not through a single observable sign, but through a shift in atmospheric pressure. The room altered its orientation. Conversations finished their current sentences and began new ones, and people turned with the particular choreography of a group, adjusting to the entrance of someone whose attention is worth something. He was speaking to Mr. Carnshaw. Hartby near the gallery's south windows, and his expression was the one she recognized as his thinking face, which she had catalogued across enough encounters to have named. Privately, though she had named it nothing out loud. Lady Dorothea had placed herself at the room's social center, with Miss Fairfax beside her, and 3 or 4 of the season's more reliable witnesses arranged at comfortable conversational distance. She said something to Mrs. Bitty Featherstone that made the group laugh, and Mrs. Featherstone repeated it in a lower voice to her nearest neighbor, and Bertie heard it carrying across the gallery in that way that particular sentences carry in particular rooms. "Still here, I see," Mrs. Featherstone said, looking toward Bertie with the pleasant, candid curiosity of someone reporting on a minor natural oddity. The hired companion. And nothing more even now. One does admire the persistence. 3. Voicings. Bertie raised her chin exactly as much as honesty required, and no further, which was a small distance, and she looked across the room at the roses in the alcove vases, which were white this evening and very fine, and she kept her hands quiet. She heard the gallery's ambient noise shift. She heard the specific quality of attention that a room develops when it has decided to watch one thing. She turned her head. Edmund was crossing the floor. He was not crossing toward the center of the room where his mother stood. He was not crossing toward Miss Fairfax, who had become very still beside Lady Dorothea, with an expression that had lost some of its pleasantness. He was crossing toward the east wall, where the retrimmed lace was, where the plain gown was, where Bertie stood with her hands quiet, and her chin at the angle that honesty required. He crossed the room in the way that certain decisive things happen, without hurry and without any possibility of mistaking the direction. The gallery had gone quiet in the way that galleries go quiet when something is happening that will be discussed at breakfast the next morning. Lady Dorothea's fan, held at its usual measured height, paused. Edmund stopped in front of Bertie. He stood close enough that she could see the exact quality of his expression, which was not the closed door she had catalogued across the season. It was the expression of a man who has spent 2 years practicing distance and has decided, with full awareness of the cost, to stop. "Miss Campbell," he said, and then deliberately, "Bertie." The room heard it. The room heard the deliberateness. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not here, not at sufficient length. But the first part of it is this. I have been watching you conduct yourself with more genuine dignity than this room has offered you in return, and I should have said so sooner. And I did not. And I regret it. She could not quite speak. Her throat had made a decision she had not consulted. I have spoken with Heartby, he said. There is no entail question that prevents what I am about to ask. I am asking plainly, in front of these witnesses, because I would prefer that the witnesses who have rendered their verdicts on you this season should be present when I render mine. He paused for one breath. I am asking you to marry me. Not as a convenience and not as a correction. As a choice. The room held itself. Lady Dorothea's fan, which had been very still, made a small motion. Her face held its composure with the effort of someone who has understood, in the space of 30 seconds, that the arrangement she has managed across a lifetime has encountered its limit. Something moved behind her eyes quickly, and it was close enough to recognition that the harshest thing one could say about it was not cruelty, but a very old certainty discovering that it had been wrong. She looked at Bertie, at the plain gown and the quiet hands and the chin still at its honest angle, and the certainty did its reckoning quietly, without announcement. Miss Fairfax stood beside her with an expression that had found its way to something almost like dignity. She looked at Edmund once, briefly, and what moved across her face in that single short clause was not grief, but the recognition of a woman understanding that the life she had imagined for herself was organized around someone else's preference, not her own, and that this might actually be a relief.
Well,
said Mrs. Pendleton from somewhere to Bertie's left, her voice entirely unsteady with feeling. My goodness! Bertie looked at Edmund. She looked at the face she had spent the season reading as a closed door, and found it open, and she found that the person looking back at her from behind it had been there the whole time, patient in the way that only people who have lost things know how to be patient. Yes, she said. He took her hand. He held it with the steadiness of someone who means to keep holding it, and the room, which had held its breath for the last 90 seconds, remembered itself and began to breathe again. Mr. Heldus. Heartby, from his position near the south windows, made a small satisfied note in the interior pocket of his coat, where the relevant paperwork had been residing since that morning's meeting. He was a careful man. He appreciated the procedural confirmation. Lady Dorothea did not make a scene. She was 61 years old and had spent those years learning that the forms mattered even when the substance was painful. And she held the forms now, moving through the room's renewed conversation with the measured grace of a woman who has been publicly overruled and is choosing to carry it correctly. She did not speak to Bertie that evening. She looked at her son once near the end of the night, and whatever passed between them across the gallery's candlelight was too contained and too private to read from any external vantage point. Edmund looked back. He did not look away. The months that followed had the quality of things being arranged into their correct positions after a long displacement. The announcement appeared in the appropriate publication, signed by the appropriate parties, and Mrs. Featherstone read it over her breakfast, and said nothing at all, which was the loudest silence she had produced all season. Miss Fairfax departed London for a visit to her aunt's house in Wiltshire, and was reported by spring to be contentedly engaged to a perfectly pleasant baronet who appreciated her greatly and required no management. Edmund settled the £3,200 outstanding against the Campbell estate's debt as a private matter between his solicitor and the cousin who had inherited. He did not mention it to Bertie until it was done, at which point she looked at him with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously, none of them easy to name. He said that it had been her father's debt, and that she had carried the weight of it long enough, and that the matter was concluded. She did not argue. She recognized by now the shape of his commands, short, declarative, framed as fact rather than as debate, and underneath them, without announcement, the specific structure of someone trying to make safe what he had been unable to make safe before. They were married in October, at the church in the village nearest Thornfield Park, with Mrs. Pendleton in the front pew and Mr. Heartby standing in the back, with the reliable patience of a man who had verified the paperwork twice and was satisfied with the outcome. By December, The 11,000 acres of Thornfield were under a thin covering of early snow, and the park's long avenue of elms held the light of the late afternoon in their bare branches, as though they had always been meant to hold it exactly that way. The long gallery was warm. Someone had lit the fire at both ends, and the rugs were the deep colors of the house's good years, and the candles on the mantelpiece reflected themselves in the window glass against the darkening park outside. The piano stood open. Bertie had not opened it. She had found it closed when Edmund first showed her the gallery in November, and she had registered the closed lid without comment because she had learned to read the room's silences the way she had learned to read his face. She had waited. He had opened it himself, one evening in late November without explanation, the way one opens a window after a long interior winter, not dramatically, simply because the time had arrived. He had stood at it for a long moment, and then sat down on the bench and placed his hands on the keys, and played 4 bars of something she did not recognize, and then stopped. She had come to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder was near his, and she had looked at his hands on the keys, and she had said nothing at all, because nothing was the correct thing to say. He had played another 4 bars.
Then another.
The phrase he had been playing was not complete. It arrived at a point and stopped, as though the ending had not yet been written, and he had lifted his hands and looked at the keys for a long moment. "Catherine played this room," he said. "I believed, when she died, that I had failed to provide the specific conditions under which she might have lived. I believed it the way one believes a clear accounting." He paused. "I have come to understand that I was the wrong instrument for the measuring, that some things are not failures of management." Bertie had reached out and placed her hand over his on the piano's edge, not on the keys, on the wood of the frame. He had not moved for a long moment, and then he had turned his hand and held hers. "The phrase has no ending," she said. "Not yet," he said. The memory of that evening sat with her now in December, as she stood at the gallery window and watched the snow come down in the slow, particular way of early winter, not urgent, only settling, covering the park's long avenue and the edges of the garden where Lady Dorothea had held her wooden box and made her offer. Bertie had replied to Lady Dorothea's letter of November, a restrained note of genuine feeling, noting that she hoped the distance between them might, in time, become something manageable. She did not know yet what the answer would be. She had sent the letter from Thornfield Park, as Roberta, Countess of Ashvale, and she had signed it Bertie, because that was who she was, and because she had decided somewhere between the Haverstock ballroom and this window. That smallness was no longer her preferred economy. Behind her, from the far end of the gallery, she heard the piano begin 4 bars, then 4 more. The phrase moved through its familiar passages and reached the place where it had always stopped before, and this time it did not stop. Edmund played through it, past it, into the bars that followed, the ones he had been unable to find before, and the music filled the gallery and reached the window where Bertie stood watching the snow, and she thought, with a clear and unhurried certainty, that this was what Chosen felt like. Not loud, not sudden. Like snow settling on known ground. Like a phrase finally finding its way home.